All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining today's Clean Transportation Standard Work Group Technical Webinar on Transportation Electrification. If we have not met yet, which I believe I've met most of you, I'm Shannon Engstrom, and I'm the Clean Transportation Standard Director with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And if you're a member of the public joining today for the first time, thank you for joining. If you have not already, I would encourage you to take a look at our website for more information about the work group and process that's underway. And of course, reach out to me if you have any questions. Oh, so there's just I just wanted to remind everyone that today's webinar is a third in a series of 4 webinars on the core fuel activities that will be part of a Minnesota Clean Transportation Standard. Last week, we discussed ethanol and biomass-based diesel. Tomorrow, we will be covering other clean fuel types and activities such as jet fuel, renewable natural gas, refinery efficiency and improvements, off-road equipment, and zero carbon intensity opportunities for electricity. We will also have a land use, water, and ecosystem services webinar on October 16th. And our next in-person meeting will be on October 24th, again held at WSB's office in Golden Valley. This meeting and all of our November work group meetings will kind of include a lot more small and large group conversations. So I would really just encourage you and almost request that you try to join in person so we can have more robust conversation. But we will, of course, still have an online option because we know sometimes that's just not possible. I also want to flag that we posted this week a primer on low carbon fuel standard policy in North America. That was written by colleagues at ICF, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. We'll also be sending a bulletin next week with all, a reminder of all the recordings for the webinars and, upcoming reminders and a link to the primer as well. So be keeping an eye out for that. And then this is a slide many of you have seen quite a few times. It just shows the objectives for both the work group meetings and technical analysis work that are happening in tandem. I share it again today just as a reminder that this work has been happening in the background, but will continue to come more to the forefront in our work group meetings as Phil and colleagues at ICF share the scenarios that they're producing and we get more into the recommendation conversations. For the agenda today, Phil Sheehy again joins us, our technical consultant from ICF, to do a deep dive on transportation electrification as it relates to GREET modeling. We'll then stop the recording and have at least 10 minutes for work group member Q&A. Phil will be holding off on answering any technical or clarifying questions until the end, but you're of course welcome to add those in the chat throughout. And then a friendly reminder to please refrain from making comments or recommendations for the standard itself. Those are really best suited for the full work group meetings. If you are a non-work group member or member of the public, please let us know in the chat if you'd like to make a comment at the end so we can make sure to allocate time for this. And lastly, we will also be sharing a feedback form at the end. And this is really to capture any additional comments or questions that you have for Phil and anything you think should be considered for the report. So with that, I will thank you again for joining and pass it over to Phil for his overview on transportation electrification.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great. And Phil, okay. I know it's very early at your time, so thank you for getting up early for us.
That's all right. I'm happy to be online with everybody again. We already jumped into it. Great, the agenda. So today, I've only got a handful of slides today, mainly because electric vehicles, regardless of which section or which market you're talking about, are kind of like a forward-looking component, like a really important component of a clean transportation standard. And they're just, and I don't mean this in again, I don't mean to poo-poo any fuel. It's a little bit smaller role at the beginning of the program, but a really big role in the mid to long term for electric vehicles. So there isn't a ton of, there's, there aren't that many electric vehicles yet on the road in Minnesota, the same way that we have like this, like longer history of, what improvements have been made in ethanol. What are the feedstocks made for biodiesel? Like it's a lot more background that we can kind of get into for those other fuels that we've talked to. Whereas most of what we're going to be talking about with respect to electricity is like what's going to happen with respect to transportation electrification and how do we incorporate that into the modeling and, into outline the role of electricity in these programs, just because again, it's kind of small at the beginning. And then, but again, it is a major component of these programs in the long term. So, and it's a little bit more dependent on your view, and that just means like, you know, collectively one's view on electrification and the rate at which that occurs. So it's a little bit less of like, well, you know, what, like it's just different issues than what we've talked about previously. So again, I've got the same cadence here. I'll talk about the 2018, the baseline. So I'm just trying to match the cadence of the webinars, match the charge to the working group. What does electricity look like in the baseline? What's the carbon intensity component of electricity? And then what does...
Further, he
wasn't
stuck with his...
There we go. Thank you. And then what's the carbon intensity look like for electricity? And that's generally a forward-looking exercise. And then what does EV deployment look like? And again, it's modest to date, but then what are the drivers for that moving forward? So that's pretty straightforward. And I'll just talk about what we'll be considering. What are the things we think about in this, like and so that you have familiarity when we present the scenario. So going into the Wayback Machine of 2018, there were about 10,000 electric vehicles in Minnesota. So from a baseline perspective, electricity in the baseline isn't a big deal. Like, no, not, again, that's like, it's great that Minnesota has a pretty good, like adoption of electric vehicles. You can see this trajectory here, plug-in electric vehicles on the left and electric vehicles on the right. You can see 2018, you know, was like when you probably start to see like some bigger change in terms of adoption, right? So, but again, it's only 10,000 vehicles, and just the amount of electricity that 10,000 vehicles consume isn't that big. So incorporating it into the baseline carbon intensity for gasoline or fuels that substitute for gasoline, incorporating into the baseline, it won't really measure, it won't really appear like in you, if you do it or not. Just to be clear, you have to make some assumption about how much electricity was consumed by those vehicles, and then you can you know, but again, it's going to be such a fractional amount of electricity compared to how much gasoline was consumed. You know, the standard against which you are measuring progress, the 2018 baseline, it won't really matter whether you incorporate electricity or not. So it's a de minimis matter for 2018, right? Just to be clear, that's what I'm saying. So it's not a matter of like just compare it with, hey, you know, in 2018, for the better part or for a significant portion of the summer, biodiesel was blended in at 20%, and in other parts of the year it was at 5%. That's a substantive component of the fuel supply system, right? Ethanol was blended in at 10%, and then higher blends. It's a substantive component of the transportation fuel mix. But in 2018, there just wasn't much electricity consumed. So you can do this. It's a rounding error, just to be in it. Again, that's not a knock on electricity. It's just the state of play in 2018. So 2018 isn't that big of a deal for us, or like when we're thinking about the baseline. You can incorporate it. You can incorporate then those 10,000 vehicles, but again, it won't have an impact on what that standard is in 2018, against which the standard needs to be, the standard against which it needs to be reduce, the standard against which CI reductions need to be achieved, right? So that 2018 standard, not a big deal. So again, that has just to do with the fact that it's early stages for electrification, and but again, it's not a reflection of like what the role of electricity would be in the future. So, and then the carbon, electricity, and state, I mean, we need to double check on this, but it's around 190 grams per megajoule in 2018. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So that seems kind of high, but so one thing about electricity that I want everybody to remember is that, I'll go to the next slide. So this note here at the top, so you'll see big numbers for you can see large numbers for the carbon intensity of electricity, but please remember that you always need to account for what's referred to as the EER, which is the energy economy ratio, and that accounts for the efficiency differences for the use of electricity in a motor versus gasoline in an engine, in a combustion engine, right? So if you take the same amount of energy and put that into a motor and then make the wheels of a car move, you go further than when you take a liquid fuel and combust it in an engine, that same unit of energy. So the EER adjusts for that. So you actually have to adjust the carbon intensity by that EER. So if you haven't, let's just say your EER is 5 for an electric vehicle application. If someone tells you that the carbon intensity of electricity is 100, then you need to divide by the EER. So so sometimes, you see an EER of like 190, and in your head earlier, I told you that the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel, if you go into the Wayback Machine a couple weeks ago, that was like 100 grams per megajoule. So at first glance, it seems high, but after you account for the efficiency of the use of energy in a motor compared to the use of energy in a combustion engine, you get you drop that carbon intensity by a factor of anywhere from 3 to 5. So that's just to normalize where you're at. And we try to present carbon intensities on an EER adjusted basis, but it gets a little complicated. So I just figured I'd introduce that here. So that's just something so moving forward, you'll probably in the report, we'll try to present the carbon intensity on an EER adjusted basis, right? So that's just and it's just a dimensionless number. So that's just to make everything interesting and maybe a little bit more confusing. But so that's just as an aside on the carbon intensity of electricity. So moving forward again, just the role of electricity, it's really interesting in the sense that you comparatively speaking, because you're talking about a fuel that is reducing its carbon intensity as a result of completely different regulatory drivers, and that improves the credit generating opportunity. At the same time, even if for some crazy reason, you achieve some penetration of electric vehicles and it just stops. This is a fake world. The credits generated by those vehicles will continue to go up because the electricity they're using is going down over time as a result of another standard. So it is an interesting thing, right? You're charging against a grid that continues to that continues to lower its carbon intensity, and then the vehicles on that grid benefit from it. Okay. So so you estimate where the grid is today. That's pretty easy. We know how much generation that is today. So again, I haven't talked too much about numbers. It's lower than that 190, but so you've got an RPS. So interestingly, or impactful for this project is, for this particular consideration for the working group, is the combination of the Senate File 4 and I can't remember what the House bill was. I think it was House Bill 7. The joint effort to extend the renewable portfolio standard with requirements around carbon-free resources. So what we'll do is we'll take where we are today. We'll take where we are today, the carbon intensity where we are today, and then implement an assumed compliance with that regulation that requires a renewable content of 55% by 2035. And then there are these carbon-free requirements of 80% for public utility, 60% for others by 2030, and then 100% by 2040. So we implement that, and then again, the carbon intensity of the grid is going to go down accordingly, right? So we just implement those. The benefit to us here is that what makes life easy for us is the nature of that regulation that says it has to be carbon free, so we don't have to it's a specific carbon-free requirement. It's sometimes in renewable portfolio standards. Not all renewable energy is created equal in the sense that you can have non-zero CI sources. So and just to be clear, we are doing this on a Minnesota, using as much data as we can for Minnesota in-state electricity, right? Or electricity that is used in the state. There might be some imports, but so that just to be clear, it is not we're modifying it to be representative of Minnesota rather than MISO, or I think technically in GREET it sits within the MRO or something like that. I think in GREET, in the eGrid model, but we are modifying that to the extent feasible to be in-state Minnesota grid electricity, right? It's not a regional grid electricity. It is a Minnesota grid electricity, to be clear. And then changing that over time to be compliant with the to be compliant with the clean energy or the renewables associated with that Senate File 4. And I don't know the name of the regulation, I forget, but it's kind of like a renewable portfolio standard. I think it's just an extension. I believe it's just an extension of the renewable portfolio standard, which again impacts the carbon intensity of the electricity that is sold by retailers. So it's pretty straightforward. Like we've got benchmark. You just decrease the carbon intensity. We have to make assumptions. We assume that it happens linearly. It's not going to happen that way, right? Like there'll be, years where there are greater reductions than not. But in the interim years, we just assume that the utilities, public and or investor owned, are on a linear trajectory to achieve those carbon-free requirements, right? Then there are other things that we can pick up in the consideration of electricity. To be clear, you can accelerate reductions in the carbon intensity of electricity. And we'll talk about that tomorrow because that kind of sits outside of just what we would consider grid charging, right? So this is just in the sense of like the delivery of electricity as a transportation fuel on the grid in Minnesota and what's driving the changes in that, okay? I'm doing great. We're doing great on time. So that's the carbon intensity component of the modeling that we'll present to folks. Again, like this is just the background. So when you see it, you'll see like, all right, carbon intensity today is X, and it reduces over time in line with these renewable portfolio requirements that will be going into effect in these timelines, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Hold on just 1 second, excuse me. Sorry about that. And then the next slide, here we go. So again, that's the carbon intensity of electricity. Remember, we usually talk about the carbon intensity of the fuel and then the trajectory of that fuel, how it's used. In this case, it's inextricably tied to the vehicles on the road. And there's a couple of different, so now you have to start making these judgments or these determinations of what electric vehicle deployment is going to look like. And that's non-trivial, right? Just to be honest, like people have different views on the rate at which electric vehicles will be adopted into the market, right? So what is the rate of adoption? And then the questions are like, what is the split of those vehicles, right? So this has more of a role. This addresses more of the question of like the carbon intensity targets that can be that have been laid out to the working group, right? Those guideposts that have been laid out to the working group. And what is the role of electricity in achieving that? So we tend to do this in like, we have a scenario that is kind of like a reference or like a modest adoption of electric vehicles, and then one that's a little bit more aggressive. You tend to that way, and then you kind of see, can you achieve those targets that are designed? That's the way we're constructing the scenarios now. And that's just to show like, because like, the growth of electric vehicles comes at the expense of the other fuels we're looking at, right? It's not like it, just to be clear, like you are displacing gasoline consumption in the light duty sector, and you're displacing diesel consumption in the heavy duty sector as you electrify. And in doing so, you reduce the opportunity for blending ethanol or biomass-based diesel, right? So you are like, and so I'm just saying like that's an important distinction. Like it's not they're in direct competition, and your rate of electrification impacts the extent to which these other fuels will play a role in the program too, right? So it's not it is important like how you adopt these things. Generally speaking, we try to just assume that they're like that regulatory drivers that you have to comply with regulations, right? In this case, it's the Clean Cars Minnesota rule. So you have to at least comply with that. And if there's indication that the market is beating that, then you can accelerate EV adoption accordingly, right? There's that approach, this Clean Cars Minnesota. That won't take you that far though, just to be honest, right? Like, so that will only get you so far with respect to EV adoption. and that's not a knock on the Clean Cars Minnesota rule. I'm just saying like that regulation doesn't drive you to like 100% electrification, right? And then in addition to that, we have a new federal proposal for multi-pollutant emission standards that was advanced by EPA earlier this year, and that is likely to drive EVs, and that would be kind of a boost in addition to the Clean Cars Minnesota rule, right? And so we'll do modeling around each of these just to kind of demonstrate like compliance with these regulations and what the EV adoption in Minnesota might look like. And then what we would do is kind of like ramp that up, right? Like say, okay, there are other factors other than regulatory drivers, right? A recognition that electric vehicles may get or will hopefully get cheaper, and that they will become a more attractive option, an increasingly attractive option to consumers in Minnesota, and that regulatory drivers can get you to some point, but then at that point, the market would be mature enough, and the total cost of ownership and other factors, consumer acceptance of the technology would be good enough to continue a trajectory of EV adoption, right? So we kind of would, and again, the objective is just kind of is not to electrify to get to 100% electrification, right? Just to be clear, but outline a couple of like 1 or 2 to 3 trajectories for EVs, for electric vehicles in the light duty sector, as a benchmark, or just to kind of see like, hey, these are the different ways that the market could evolve. Because again, it has a material impact on whether or not you can achieve the targets, and then at what and what the impact is on the other fuels we've talked about, right? So that's the importance of electric vehicles in a program like this. And I talked about EER previously. So California adopted energy economy ratios associated with its low carbon fuel standard in 2010. They added EERs for heavy duty vehicles, I think in the 2015 timeline. Don't quote me on that. It might have been a little bit earlier, a little bit later. I can't remember, but I think it was 2015. Those EER values have been adopted in Oregon and then subsequently adopted in Washington. There hasn't been like a substantive revisiting of those values. That's not a criticism of any other state, but if it's conceivable that there are the EER, the efficiency of electric vehicles relative to gasoline powered vehicles may have like moved a little bit. So again, that's something that this group could take on, right? Or could recommend, or could say like, hey, let's take a look at that. I'm just highlighting that as like, there's nothing that says you have to accept the EER from another state, right? Like you could say, hey, I think that the EER is a little too low or a little too high. I don't have a view on that. Just to be clear, I'm just saying that other states have just simply adopted the EER values that are included in the regulation in California. But it is something that I know that there are stakeholders who in other places who have said, hey, we should take a look at these. And again, I believe that there are stakeholders who think that they are both too low or too high. So it's not like, so maybe in that regard, the EERs are just right. But again, that's something that you don't have to accept it as dogma or whatever the right term is, right? So you can say, hey, let's take a closer look at this, and it could be different, right? So again, the objective there, like what we're trying to do in the modeling, I haven't put like numbers to this because like what we're trying to do is show that, hey, there's kind of like this, like, are EVs just like taken up because of regulatory reasons? And then, or is it like, regulatory drivers and then consumers adopt it, right, at an accelerated rate? And again, that's just like, we don't know, but there are a variety of ways to consider that, right? So you kind of have to paint these two pictures where there is modest transportation electrification in the light duty sector, and then that is in line with regulation. And then you kind of have another one that's a little bit more aggressive where you're like, you beat regulations. So just as an example, California is ahead of its ZEV target, right? Just to be clear, like California, like the Clean Cars Minnesota rule is modeled after California's Advanced Clean Cars regulation. And California is ahead of its target for advanced clean cars. That does not refer to advanced clean cars 2, but the rate at which EVs have been adopted in California, and other states have done this too. I'm not just saying that, but I just know California better, is ahead of that. So there is reason to believe that, if you have a modest regulatory driver for electric vehicles, it's conceivable that consumer interest and then the vehicle offerings from OEMs that the market outpaces what the regulation requires. So we just want to recognize those two futures, right? We don't want to fall below a regulatory standard. That's generally a no in our modeling. And then we want to say, like, that's kind of like your baseline, but then you want to demonstrate a future that has higher potential than that. So I'll go to we'll do great on time, and I will finish here on my last slide. Very similar. Heavy duty, the only difference with heavy duty EVs is you want to focus more on specific vocations. Like, you want to parse out the fleet more than just light duty vehicles in general. Is like a little bit lumpier. It's easier. Whereas like the opportunity for electrification in heavy duty vehicles is likely going to be focused on specific vocations. And by that, I mean, there are specific vehicles that drive specific patterns that are optimal for adopting an electric vehicle solution. So you want to incorporate that in your modeling and prioritize those, right? Rather than just saying, it's a little bit different. You want to focus on that, like in the heavy duty sector, because the way those vehicles are driven is quite different, right? Like a regional delivery vehicle, right? Like a class 4, like box truck or something like that, is driving around town and making deliveries, versus like a class 8 truck that is cruising from one side of the state to the other as part of some logistics provider. That's a little bit trickier to electrify than like somebody who's driving around town, right? So that's what I mean by the vocation. So you want to have some vocation specific considerations in your modeling. And then you want to say that the opportunities for medium duty electrification, there aren't as the regulatory drivers for medium and heavy duty electrification aren't as strong as they are for light duty right now. So again, there aren't a strong regulatory driver now, but then we do have these phase 3 standards that have been proposed by the feds, and that starts in model year 2027. And we have done modeling around that in the same way we've done modeling around the multi-pollutant emission standards that on the light duty side. And it's likely that like compliance with that will incorporate electric vehicles on the medium duty, heavy duty side from the regulator side. So that's all I have for today. That leaves us time for questions. So I'll go back to these slides. So like, again, it's electric vehicles, modest contribution to the program in the early years, with growing, again, because like growing more than any, like the opportunity for electric vehicles is, pretty big compared to the other fuels, because it's a new kind of emerging like option in this, electric vehicles. The adoption is increasing, and at the same time, the grid is getting cleaner, right? So again, the volume of the fuel is increasing at the same time, that as a result of another regulatory pressure, the grid is getting cleaner. So like the role of electric vehicles increases substantially over time, and it's really just becomes a matter of like, what do you assume the rate of adoption is? And again, what we want to present to the group is more of like, the role of electric vehicles in this type of program, like assuming like complying with regulations, and then, a faster than expected uptake than just regulatory drivers, right? Those are kind of the two futures we want to present to folks, and then show how the differences between those manifest themselves with respect to other low carbon fuels. Like what are the pressures that applies on liquid biofuels, stuff like that, because that's like an important aspect of the program. So I'll pause there, or I think I'm done there, and then I think we can turn it to the chat.
Great.
Or
Thanks
to
so
the
much.
question.